Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and the topic for tonight is um, It's the Money, Stupid, and Beat the Fascists. Hello, Dolores. I see you're here on YouTube and on Facebook. And hi, Dale Weaver. It's been quite a while. So glad to see you back, though. Steve Wolfbrand, always good to see you, Steve. Okay. Hey, Kay, there you are. Great to see you, too. So I want to start off with a piece by Thom Hartmann. How do you like that? That's a really good piece that he did. When did he do it? Oh, let me do one more thing. Before I take on that piece. So you're seeing the piece now on the screen. It's by Thom Hartmann. Title of it is The U.S. Oligarchy is Getting Exactly the Kind of Election It Paid For. And Thom wrote it, or published it anyway, today in Common Dreams. The polls are tightening up right now, and the media is treating it like it's some mystical force of nature, causing people to shift their concerns from abortion, guns, climate, democracy, and the survival of Social Security over to gas prices, black crime, banning books, and trans kids playing sports. The media, of course, knows what's going on. They're the secondary recipients of it, right behind the politicians, because they're making billions conveying the GOP message to America, which, of course, is why they won't tell you what the real game is here or how it's being played. In the early 1970s, I was a partner with the late Terry O'Connor in a small Michigan advertising agency, Tur Graphics, and a copywriter for another, Barden Durst, run by the late Bob Strand. Our biggest clients were Kellogg's and Michigan National Bank, and I learned the business from these men and from in-person instruction by the legendary Joe Sugarman, to whom I'm grateful to this day. Later in the 70s, I taught marketing and advertising in cities around the world for the American Marketing Centers. And in 1989, started the Atlanta advertising agency, Chandler, McDonald, Stout, Schneiderman, and Poe, named after my favorite writers and my best friend, which Louise and I, that's Tom's wife, sold in 1997 to retire to the mountains of Vermont. CMSS&P primarily did business as the newsletter factory, and our clients included more than 100 of the Fortune 500 companies at that time. Wow. As well as government agencies from the U.S. Army to the NASA and the CIA. I've also been hosting what is today the number one progressive talk show in America for 19 years and worked in radio news for 7 years before that. I say all this not by way of bragging, but hopefully to convince you that I know something about media and advertising and marketing business. And if there's anything I know deep in my gut from decades of observation and experience, it's that advertising works when it's done big and done repeatedly. While creativity and production values in advertising are important, they're both subordinate to frequency when it comes to producing results. Even a poorly crafted message for a mediocre product will convince people to act the way you want them to if it's repeated frequently enough. In a variation of the 1980s cliche about toys, whoever ends the campaign having spent the most money typically wins. Between 80 and 95% of the time, the biggest spender in a political race wins, with the average biggest spender winning around 91% of the time. Multiple studies have been done about money in politics over the past few decades, and the results are always within a few points of each other. Between 80 and 95% of the time, the biggest spender in a political race wins, with the average biggest spender winning around 91% of the time. Which is why the new analysis of campaign spending in the 2022 midterm race should concern every American. Open Secrets has found that more than $4.4 billion has been spent so far just on electing members of the U.S. House and Senate. And 2/3 of senators are not even up for re-election this year, with an expected $9.3 billion going to radio, TV, social media, and other forms of advertising by election day. NPR found, based on data from the ad tracking firm Ad Impact, that in just a dozen Senate races, over $1.6 billion has been spent, quote, with 3 out of every $4 being spent in 6 states: Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Ohio. And here, let me put in just a footnote on this. In Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, and also Ohio, in each of those states, the Republicans have been running very low quality candidates in their run for the Senate. In Georgia, of course, you have the famous Herschel Walker, who has nothing to commend him at all, except that he's a former football star. In Pennsylvania, of course, we have Dr. Oz. The less said about him, the better. In Arizona, Blake Masters. And Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, who has been for 6 years a terrible senator and yet is in the lead for re-election right now. In fact, if I recall, this might be his second re-election. He might already have been in for 12 years. Okay, Nevada has a guy whose last name is Laxalt, who comes from a family by the name, of Laxalt, and they've been governors and senators from from Nevada for quite a long time. For them, the name of the game is name recognition, and the current scion of that family to be running, well, he at least learned politics from the rest of his family. He has that to actually commend him. He doesn't look like he's as empty-headed as some of the others. He was the one state in which a candidate that may have something to commend him is running. And then in Ohio, there's the inimitable J.D. Vance, who has nothing but a pile of money to commend him. Going on, most of that money, NPR reports, is coming from dark money outside groups with little to no donor transparency, and Republicans are getting a big boost from them. Of the nearly $1 billion in unregulated outside money that's been spent so far just to elect Republicans to the Senate, NPR notes, quote, 86% of the money going toward pro-GOP TV ads is coming from these outside groups, compared to 55% for Democrats. Put simply, if it weren't for these outside groups, Republican candidates would be swamped on the airwaves. This is not how a Democratic Republic is supposed to work, says Tom, and it would have represented a federal felony just 12 years ago. That was when 5 corrupt Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court blew open the doors to billionaires and massive corporations taking ownership of the GOP and much of the American political process with their poisonous Citizens United decision. Now, while all that is right, it blew open the doors to corporations taking ownership of the Democrats, too. It's not like the Democrats have clean hands on this. They take huge amounts of money and they get huge amounts of support from independent expenditures and from dark money as well. Simply put, the elections are, quote, tightening, unquote, because right-wing billionaires and giant corporations are pouring billions of dollars into advertising. And as noted earlier, advertising works. To quote the 2014 Washington Post headline, quote, 91% of the time, the better finance candidate wins. Don't act surprised, unquote. Top of their advertising dominance, though, the GOP has a second tool for repeating their message so frequently that listeners are hearing it in their dreams. Specifically, billionaire oligarch Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, quote unquote, to additional right wing television networks, over 200 television stations regularly carrying right wing editorials and right wing tilted newscasts, and over 1,500 radio stations carrying right wing hate radio, almost 300 of them in Spanish. Nothing like this massive right wing Republican media operation, carefully built at the cost of billions over a 4-decade period, exists on the Democratic side. And it provides a massive 24/7, 365 boost to the GOP that's worth tens of billions a year in quote, earned media, unquote, also known as, quote, free advertising promotion, unquote. It even makes money for its owners rather than costing anybody anything. When George W. Bush was president, he used to invite talk radio hosts to broadcast live from the lawn of the White House every summer. Obama killed the practice, in part because there are only a handful of nationally syndicated or even local progressive hosts in the country, and in part because the Democratic Party has never taken seriously the power of talk radio. You can read the whole sorry tale in an article I wrote 2 years ago for The Nation, and in a 2018 open letter I wrote to billionaire Tom Steyer when Clear Channel was up for sale. If Republicans retake the House, the Senate, or both this November, after the Dobbs decision, their naked attempt to overthrow our government, their promises to end Social Security, and their playing footsie with Vladimir Putin on Ukraine, it will be entirely because of the billions in dark money that supports them. And who can blame the billionaires and corporations behind this corruption? First off, it's been fully legalized by the Supreme Court. Second, it's a fantastic investment, as they saw in 2016 pour $7 billion into an election, and within the first year get almost $2 trillion in tax breaks and another trillion in forgivable loans with few strings attached. I understand where the $2 trillion in tax breaks comes from. I don't understand where the other trillion in forgivable loans with few strings attached comes from. It doesn't seem to me to be a reference to the CARES Act. There were lots of forgivable loans in the CARES Act. If my recollection is right, much more than $1 trillion in forgivable loans. But I can't remember the same thing happening in 2017, so I'm not sure what that particular reference is to. Anyway, billionaires win, corporations win, corrupt politicians win. The only losers are democracy and the American people. And let's be frank, the billion-dollar corporations that own our media and our politicians don't really give a rat's ass about either democracy or the American people, as long as we keep buying the products and voting for the politicians advertised on their networks. As CBS's then CEO, Les Moonves said back in 2016, quote, "Man, who would have expected the ride we're all having right now? It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. The money's rolling in, and this is fun. I've never seen anything like this. And this is going to be a very good year for us. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Keep going. Big money in politics and a democracy that works for the majority of the people of a nation are incompatible. Just ask any Russian or their victims in Ukraine. I'm not going to say anything about that because Tom and I kind of disagree about what's going on in Ukraine and in Russia. But that's a story for another day. Meanwhile, both Republicans and the media will point out that Democrats are getting dark money too, as if that means everything is equal. I don't mean to suggest that everything, okay, is equal, though I did mention earlier that Democrats are getting dark money too. But what the right wing billionaires know is one, if they flood the zone with too much money, it'll get noticed, so they're careful to just match and then only slightly surpass the money Democrats can raise. This prevents widespread political outrage and lets Republicans win, quote, close elections, unquote, as if everything was still normal and our democracy was working as it should. Thus, the closing gap, quote unquote, stories we're reading right now. Three, but they know in a pinch they can always just dump another few million or $1 billion when a race is essential to their interest. Plus, having a few Democrats like Manchin and Sinema in their pockets is their ultimate ace in the hole. Republicans on the Supreme Court have, with their bizarre, quote, money is free speech, unquote, decisions, put America on the fast track to oligarchy, authoritarianism, and ultimately tyranny. There are multiple ways to overcome or overturn Citizens United and the other corrupt SCOTUS decisions that have handed our nation's elections over to their billionaire patrons. I wrote an entire book about it, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. If people power beats big money in this election, Democrats must focus as much of their donors' efforts as possible on overturning these democracy destroying decisions while starting the long project of building out a media infrastructure so the rest of America can hear their message every day, year round. Otherwise, the right wing billionaires will simply toss 20 or 30 billion or whatever it takes into the 2024 election, and President Trump or President DeSantis will make sure it's the last honest political race in American history. Well, I guess I got to disagree with that because I think there's already too much that's been done by the forces of fascism, the right wing billionaires, so that the 2024 election is not going to be an honest political race. Hopefully, it won't be dishonest enough to exclude the possibility that the Democrats will win. I believe that's true. I believe they still have a chance. But it is touch and go. There are a lot of built in advantages in the gerrymandering and the voter suppression that going into the race, the Republicans have a built in advantage in the House of probably 7 points, which the Democrats have to overcome. And they have to overcome it in the face of all this advertising that Tom is talking about going on. We've watched this movie play out in Russia and a few other countries over the past 4 decades. Let's not allow it to happen here, too. So, to summarize this article, what I'm going to say is it's the money, stupid, going into political campaigns, going into advertising, that is determining the makeup of the Congress, the House, and the Senate, and very often the victor in the presidency as well. But especially with the House, especially with the Senate, the oligarchy is getting exactly the kind of election it paid for. The money is determining the policies. The money is deciding the issue. The money has transformed one whole branch of government into an ideological machine that operates with an in-your-face outrageousness and corruption that is simply mind-boggling. And so the question arises, how are we going to beat this particular machine? How are we going to beat the fascist political system that it is creating? Let's move on to the second of our articles now. Keeping that question in mind. Let me pull it up. This is by Norman Solomon. Oh, by the way, that's a picture of Marjorie Taylor Greene. Everybody knows who she is, right? And progressives have but one option on election day: vote to defeat the neo-fascist GOP. I gotta say, to begin with, I don't know about the neo. This is by Norman Solomon. Okay, Norman Solomon is a longtime writer, a friend of Bernie Sanders. He was one of the surrogates for Bernie in the 2020 campaign. And one of his main points in this article is claiming that there are no significant differences between the two parties is a form of super ideological gaslighting on automatic pilot. I think that's a nifty formulation. That maybe we should think about some more. But to go on, and also I want to point out, Norman Solomon published this in Common Dreams on October 25th, 2022. 6 months ago, people on the left in France faced a crucial choice. None of their candidates had gotten enough votes to make it into the presidential runoff election. On the upcoming ballot were the neoliberal president, specifically Emmanuel Macron, and the neo-fascist challenger, specifically Marine Le Pen, who had trailed the incumbent in the first round by less than 5 percentage points. What to do? what to do. Rather than sit out the decisive election and enable the far-right candidate to take power, millions of leftist voters held their nose and voted for Macron. Now, progressives in the United States face similar choices. In key House districts and states with pivotal Senate races, including Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, leftist voters could tip the balance of congressional power. At this point in the balloting that ends on November 8th, the choice is binary: neoliberalism or neo-fascism. So neoliberalism is a specific way of thinking with an ideology that has been made quite explicit. It's not the same as old style types of liberalism in the 19th century, but it shares a lot of characteristics with it, especially on the economic side. So it's properly spoken of, I think, as neoliberalism. But when it comes to neo-fascism, I'm not sure there's anything neo about it. The current day fascists we see playing politics in Europe, in Ukraine. I don't know if there's anything that's neo about them. They just seem very much like plain old fascists. But to me, I don't see anything neo about but Donald Trump. He's calling publicly for violence. He's calling for the overturn of elections. He exhibits the basic characteristics of fascism, at all times. He did fail to overturn the American system of politics his first time around, a fact which is probably due to his lack of persistence and lack of a comprehensive ability to plan. But as his activities did build what is undeniably a fascist movement in this country. And even if he doesn't win in 2024, we'll be contending with fascist politics, I'm sure, for generations. France has had Marine Le Pen as part of their political system, distorting their elections now for generations. Her father was her fascist forebear. She is second generation fascist and is coming much closer than her father ever did to taking over the government. While the GOP is in a strong position to win a majority in the House of Representatives, the latest polling indicates that the control of the Senate is on a knife's edge. No doubt Senator Mitch McConnell is helping that enough progressives won't vote for Democrats so he can run the place starting in January. You don't have to tell me how awful and how corrupted by corporate money the Democratic Party leadership is on foreign policy, other than on such matters as climate and the Iran nuclear deal. The two major parties have similar approaches, including widely destructive forms of militarism. But on domestic matters, while the Democrats' tepid reformism falls far short of addressing the crises we face. Their policies are vastly better than the increasingly racist Republican Party, as it offers extreme versions of free market economics and Christian fundamentalism, claiming that there are no significant differences between the parties as a form of super ideological gaslighting on automatic pilot. Norman Solomon forgot the steroids here. On steroids should have been someplace in that phrase. Anyway, abortion rights, judicial appointments, climate, environmental protection, taxation, racial justice, voting rights, labor rights, LGBTQ rights, um, um, also misogyny, and so many other basic matters are on the line. Yes, the Democrats are often anemic on such issues. At the same time, the Republicans are much worse, and their agenda now includes nothing less than destroying electoral democracy. I remind you here that in previous programs, we've discussed the independent state legislature doctrine that if declared by the Supreme Court to be constitutional, in a case that is being considered right now, would give the legislatures in the states the power to overturn decisions by the voters and install the legislature's own preference as the winner of elections. Now, that hasn't happened now in centuries. But we have a case on the docket right now being considered, and a Supreme Court with 6 crazy people on it that could well decide that we no longer decide presidential elections and no longer decide elections in states. By we, I mean the voters, but that such elections will be openly decided by state legislatures controlled by the Republican Party, which has been bankrolled to take control of the majority of legislatures in the states, making those legislatures one-party dictatorships. That is what we face right now. Since those legislatures are also controlled by donors, we are talking about the union of corporate money and rich people's money that in other times and places has gone by the name of fascism. Republicans in office and even more extremist candidates seeking to join them are blending in with political scenery they've created to normalize gliding farther and farther rightward. They're the electoral shock troops of a party now fully engaged in what scholar Jason Stanley, in his book How Fascism Works, calls, quote, fascist politics. What seemed dangerously outrageous not long ago can soon come to seem normal, becoming even more dangerous. In Stanley's words, normalization of fascist ideology, by definition, would make charges of fascism seem like an overreaction. Even in societies whose norms are transforming along these worrisome lines, the charge of fascism will always seem extreme. Normalization means that the goalposts for the legitimate use of extreme terminology, continually move. So progressives have overarching responsibilities to oppose the corporate power that ushers in oligarchy, and also to oppose the far right forces that lead to tyranny. Focusing on just one of those responsibilities while dodging the other just will not do. It's accurate to say that the neoliberalism of the Democratic Party has been creating and exacerbating conditions that fuel right wing engines. But at certain times, which definitely include the next 2 weeks through Election Day on November 8th, electoral battles come to a decisive fork in the road. We will be living with the consequences of this crossroads for the rest of our lives. So, what must we do? What must we do between now and Election Day and even thereafter? Because we have to do everything we can for the cheating that's going to take place after November 8th. We have to do everything we can to fight and to beat the fascists. As Chris Hedges has said, we don't fight the fascists because we expect to win. We fight the fascists because they are fascists. Fighting the fascists is good in itself, in other words. It's a moral imperative. It's a categorical imperative. How can we fight the fascists? In large part, this comes down to how can we disempower the donors and re-empower democracy? The answer, it seems to me, is deceptively simple, and we ought to apply it right now to the extent that we possibly can. Now, I've been pushing this idea for a year and have yet to get very far with it. But the basic way of fighting this, the basic way of doing this, is to apply a litmus test of the candidates. And that litmus test is that as voters, we need to vote against the candidates who have taken or received the most support from the big money interests, from the corporates, from the wealthies, from the party committees that are representing them, from the super PACs that are spending without a formal connection in order to elect certain candidates. What we have to do is pay attention to Open Secrets, pay attention to other publications that give us the facts about who's been getting what money, how much, okay, and how. And we have to vote against the people who are getting the most of that kind of money. not the small donations. The small donations are fine, but the large donations coming through the super PACs, coming through the PACs, coming through the corporations, coming through the party committees, being given by candidates themselves who are members of the oligarchy. When we look at a race at any level, okay, of any kind, we have to find out who is getting the most money, and we have to use that litmus test to decide we're going to vote against that particular candidate. We're going to dump the corruption. We're going to dump the incumbents. We're going to dump the challengers who are raising the most money from those financial interests. And we have to follow that rule. And I guarantee that if we do, we will win against the forces of money. We will turn the money in on itself. We will turn the money against itself. We will make the money toxic, make the big money toxic to the candidates. Receiving, accepting, being supported by the most money will turn into a campaign death sentence for the candidates that get that kind of support. We must make it a death sentence. We must make it the only issue. That way, if we defeat all the candidates in the current midterms who are running with the most amount of big money, if enough of us do that, they will lose unexpectedly. They will lose. It will be a huge surprise because it won't be about what the polls are saying. It won't be about what the opinions of people are now. It won't be about the Republican or Democratic teams. And which team do you like? Like which football team do you have an affection for or an affiliation for? It will be cold, hard voting about who's taking that money, who's raising that money, and who is not. And voting against the people who are more successful at raising this kind of money will make that money toxic, will disempower the oligarchs, will turn the advertising advantage against them. Thom Hartmann talks about that advertising advantage and how important it is, and how the people with that advantage win 91% of the time. If we acted according to the dump the corruption litmus test, those people would lose 91% of the time. And if they did, that would disempower the oligarchs. They would not control politics anymore. Successful candidates would have to look to the people for support, and they would have to get that support by going to the people with ground campaigns based on small dollar donations and with campaigns that advance bills that are for democracy and that are for the people. Now we can start this right now in the next 2 weeks, and we can turn this election around. Sure, some of the Democrats are going to lose because they've been taking this kind of big money. In 2024, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema would lose if the election period were dominated by this kind of thinking. They would lose. Mitch McConnell would lose. The whole Republican Party would lose. Most of the Democratic Party would lose. I shouldn't say would lose too, because it will probably be true in a higher percentage of cases that the Republican Party has a marginal advantage over the Democratic Party in the big money that it takes. If we want to change the political system, that is what we must do. Now, what about Norman Solomon's recommendation that in spite of the corruption of the Democratic Party in this election, we have to vote for the Democratic Party to stop the system from falling into open fascism? I certainly agree with that, but I don't think it's in conflict with what I am suggesting. If you vote against the people who are taking the big money, you will be voting against the donors making their money toxic, and by and large, you will be voting against the return of the Republicans to power. You'll be voting against, for example, Ron Johnson. You'll be voting against Dr. Oz. You'll be voting against Herschel Walker. You'll be voting against Blake Masters. You'll be voting against all manner of House candidates who are election deniers. You'll be voting against people in the state legislatures who want to overturn and deny democratic elections. And you will be voting against, in most cases, the Republican candidates, and especially the Republican candidates coming from the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party. So that's what I am advocating for. Okay, at this point, I think it meets the danger Norman Solomon is talking about. I think it also takes care of the problem of advertising, because where does the advertising advantage come from? It comes from the financial advantage that these candidates get. So I think That is what we should be doing. That is what we have to do. I will also say, though, if you don't have time to find out who is the candidate that has the most support from the big financial interests, you can generally use as a proxy that in most cases it's going to be the Democratic candidate who is running for office. Now, there will be some Democratic candidates who raise more because they have a small dollar advantage, but you can easily find out who they are. It won't take a lot of research or thought to find out who they are. There will be people like Chris Deluzio, like Summer Lee, like John Fetterman, like Katie Porter, generally like the members of the squad. So some of you are going to ask, well, the squad's always selling out. It is always selling out. Why does the squad sell out? It doesn't sell out because its members are getting big money from the financial interests in any kind of direct sense. The squad is selling out because it's getting crunched by the people who are totally controlled by the money. Get rid of those people, and in January, it will be a markedly different squad in terms of their behavior. Any problems the squad has now, most of the problems the Congressional Progressive Caucus has now, will be solved by getting the big money out of politics, which you do by voting against the big money candidates. So that's how you handle that. Okay, it's time for questions and comments. Okay, also, if you'd like to bring me my pills, that would be very good.
I wanted to ask you about how to identify fascists.
How to identify fascists?
Yes, it's for the general public.
Well, there's an easy way these days to identify who the fascists are. If they are election deniers, if they're for giving power in the state legislatures, for the state legislatures to overturn elections, if they're calling for violence, those are tests for identifying who the fascists are. If they so identify with Donald Trump that they think that anything Donald Trump says is automatically right, they are the shock troops of the fascist movement in the United States. Okay, back to the beginning to look for comments. We have people greeting each other, of course. And Kay Ryan says, been watching Hartman show for many years. I know, Kay. As you can tell, I like Tom Hartman too. Kay says, he used to love Brunch with Bernie. Yeah, that was good. Lana says, hi, Stephen K. And there are more greetings going all around. And Sandy says, yuck, Oz. Yes, Sandy and Vance on Ohio. Yeah, by the way, I don't care for the neoliberal Tim Ryan specifically either. But are you kidding me? J.D. Vance? You're considering voting for J.D. Vance as opposed to Tim Ryan? Steve Wolfbrand says, I think we might be surprised, Doc. The mood in this country is very sour. Okay, I know. And for that reason, I wouldn't be surprised if we lose. But we cannot lose. We have to recognize that we've got to fight as hard as we can to stop the out and out fascists from taking over the government. Now, we've got a lot of fascists, authoritarians among the Democrats, too. And on my recommendation, it's inevitable that this time we will be electing some of those wearing the label Democrat. I know that. We'll be electing warmongers. We'll be electing those who are risking World War III right now. Why is this the case? It's the case because we failed to beat the big money takers and the warmongers when they were running in the primaries, because we failed to apply the litmus test that I'm speaking of. We didn't take it seriously. We paid attention to all kinds of irrelevant factors during the primaries. Many of us didn't vote in the primaries at all, and the moneyed interests were free to control who got nominated. There were three wonderful candidates in Washington state who were beaten rather badly because we did not apply the litmus test that I am suggesting. There were two excellent candidates in North Carolina who lost, who could have won if we followed the litmus test. We lost a great candidate, in Philadelphia, Alexandra Hunt, because we did not apply the litmus test. We lost a great candidate in Texas, Jessica Cisneros, because we did not apply the litmus test. We lost someone who probably would have been a great candidate in San Francisco because we did not apply the litmus test in the primary against Nancy Pelosi, the queen of the congressional oligarchs. We could have turned things upside down during the primary season. We could do the same thing in 2024 if we pay attention and we realize the primary season is the time to get rid of the representatives of the oligarchs on the Democratic side. Well, what about the issue that right now the Republican Party looks better, far better than the Democratic Party when it comes to the issue of whether we're going to get into World War III or not? So I'm just going to have to give an opinion here. If the Republican Party takes over and has their way in this particular election, they will probably lock up the election system for good, and we will not be able to choose any other representatives other than Republican representatives in 2024. And we won't be able to choose a Democratic candidate for president in 2024. We surely won't be able to elect a third party candidate in 2024 because the elections are going to be rigged. They're going to be rigged up and down. And insofar as they're not rigged, the independent state legislature doctrine will probably determine the electoral outcome in the states that will govern the electoral votes in the states. So he won't be able to win the presidency either. So, isn't it better to have the fascists but take over than have World War III? Well, to this, I have to say, yes, it would be better. It would be horrible, but it would be better. Because World War III is just the ultimate horror and dooms the planet anyway. However, we don't know whether the group of stumblebums we now have in office will get to World War III. We know there are many in the State Department and other places that want to get to World War III and are trying to push us toward it. But we also know there still are a lot of people in government who are absolutely opposed to it. What was that flurry of phone calls that took place among the defense ministers of key countries this past week? It was a flurry of phone calls that was initiated by the Russian defense minister, talking about the possibility that the Ukrainians are putting together a dirty bomb. Of course, the United States is saying, no, that's not happening. It was the Russians who were putting together a dirty bomb. But the fact is, these defense ministers, including Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, were talking to each other, not talking through their superiors in the political system. Why were they talking directly to each other in round-robin calls? I think a part of the reason is because they very well knew that the defense establishments in the various countries did not want World War III. They did not want the Ukraine situation to blow up into a nuclear war. And they were interested in exchanging knowledge of what they knew about the activities of the Ukrainians. So the PPP loans, K, were of course, in 2020 and 2021. They weren't 1 year after 2016. That was 2017. So it couldn't have been the PPP loans that he was referring to. So, if I'm right, the defense ministers are resisting the drift into nuclear war and are resisting the drift into World War III because they very well know that World War III means nuclear war. I think the defense ministers are trying to get the political authorities in various countries to back off. I have to mention that so far the conservatives in the UK have been absolutely insane in their foreign policy. Boris Johnson, nuts. Liz Truss, crazy. It's undetermined, however, whether Rishi Sunak is going to be that way. He may be an austerity monger. He may be a cruel globalist. But it seems to me he's quite a bit smarter than Boris, okay, or Liz. It seems to me that he's not going to want to risk World War III either. And he may be quite willing to back off and to put shackles on the Ukrainians, who, of course, are all for World War III because they think that's the only thing that can save them from the Russians. They're probably right about that. Their interest is to push everybody into World War III. Yes. And everybody should be looking at them that way and should be placing the shackles on them and making sure they don't wag the dog into World War III. The way the Austrians wagged the Austrian dog into World War I. Anyway, I think in the end, the militaries of all the countries in the world will persuade people like the President of the United States to back off in time. So I am saying we will not get into World War III. We do not now have the capacity to fight World War III from a military point of view. We're going to have to build up forces for 2-3 years to get to the point where we can deal with that particular problem. We are not ready now. Our military knows that. Other militaries know that. We cannot stop the Russians from winning the war in Ukraine. We can declare a new war ourselves and keep that going over a period of time. But in my view, we cannot stop the conquest, of Ukraine by right now without a negotiated settlement. We have to do diplomacy. If Ukraine is to survive in any form, we don't have any choice. If we refuse to do it, the Russians will work their will. We can declare war on them and have that war last until we can get ready to fight it. But that's going to be a disaster for this country. Just a disaster for this country. So Steve says, I don't think private citizens are donating much anymore. We got pretty burned by Bernie. A lot of private citizens have been giving to John Fetterman. He has raised an awful lot of money. A lot of other candidates also raised an awful lot of money through small donations. Private citizens are donating, but even now, even though they've been burned by Bernie. I agree with you, they were burned by Bernie. Sandy says the bribes are just too high. They want the money and they will sell out their mothers to get it. That's true, Sandy. That's true. However, there are people who aren't running with the big money. They're running against it. And many of them don't want it. They're not accepting it in their campaigns. And if they win because of that, they will not be selling out their mothers to get it. Kay says, vote blue. I need my SS. Yes, I need my SS too. Kay says, too many of us are in the same boat. I get $725 a month, and that is it. Steve Wolfbrand said, I watched the Fetterman debates. Ugh. Yeah, I watched it too. That was ugh. But, okay, I'll tell you something. Even though it was ugh, Fetterman might have won the debate on grounds of authenticity, but sincerity, and simply sympathy for his position in that particular debate. He showed a lot of character in coming to the debate and subjecting himself to it. I'm not sure that particular decision was the right one, but he still made some very central points. Points that he won. Especially when it came to abortion rights. I think Oz lost those exchanges. I think he lost the exchanges concerning whether Fetterman or Oz was for the people. I think the exchanges certainly came off that Fetterman was the guy who was more likely to stand for the people than Oz. I don't think Oz dispelled the idea that he was running in this race for the power, not running in this race to serve the people. That's a central issue in this campaign. And Oz did not do well when it came to this issue. And Steve Wolfbrand says, Kay, they will bump you 8.25%. Okay, I believe about the same as inflation. It's 8.7%. Okay, in other words, the cost of living bump in Social Security is going to be roughly 8.7% this year. Still too low. And of course, coming later than the expenditures. If the inflation has been 8.25% over this last year, it means that Social Security was 8.25% behind over last year. That amount will not be made up by going to 8.7% right now. If you want to make it up, you probably have to go to something like 13.5% now. Kay says, not enough. We need Larson's Social Security 2100 Act. And the Sanders-Warren $200 a month increase as well. Ghostbusters has been listening and holding my toxicity at K. Ryan. The SS raise averages $140. Yes. K says, not for me and many others. Yes, it averages $140. For K, well, if K gets $725,
Do you need this?
yes. Let me see it. Damn. What is that? So her monthly should go up to $788 at this point from $725. In absolute numbers, that is not a very big raise. It's like, if you're underwater, it's like, oh, I'm underwater. I get the Social Security raise. So now, I'm like this. I still can't breathe. It's sort of like that for her. Ghostot says, Superman at Steve Wolfbrand. Says, hi, Steve. What Steve? Steve Gonzo. Steve Ghoststart. Steve Wolfbrand is Steve. Ghoststart is Steev. Steve Wolfbrand, K, you're looking at about a $60 a month increase. Wow. Steve says, Lana has dyslexia. Exactly, not enough. Hey, Lana Dell hates the clock. We're on the same team. Steve Day says, ooh, I'm late. Antifa. Steve Day, Shock Troop, Steve Wolfbrand. Yeah, we are buds. Lana says, unfortunately, cannot find the cross-eyed emoji. Kay says, I don't care for Ryan either. I voted for Morgan Harper in the primary. You remember, I interviewed Morgan Harper. Steve Wolfbrand said, I don't have a lot of faith in our elections, Doc, and I'm not fascist. Yeah, I didn't say I had a lot of faith, in our elections. I think they're rigged. The question, and I've said that the rigging gives the Republicans a built-in advantage of 7 points in House races. So yeah. This is an issue of how much rigging and how effective it is. I think it's much more effective in the primaries than it is in the general. Is the litmus test understand MMT? No, that is not the litmus test. The litmus test is if you take more big money than the other guy or gal, we vote against you. That's the litmus test. It's about the money, about making the money toxic. If the money is made to be toxic, then the representatives will learn MMT because they're going to want to advocate for policies that are based on MMT. They'll learn MMT or they'll employ people who know MMT. Steve Day says, no pay go Nancy. Steve Wolfbrand says, watch Hardlands Media. Kay says, I don't watch them anymore as they just depress me. Sandy says, time to move to Norway. Kay says, yes, Sandy, take me too.
Me too.
Sandy says, you got it, Kay. Kay says, thank you, Sandy. Sandy says, a heart. Okay, I say, it's too late for us all to move to Norway. If we were back in our 20s, we probably could do that. But now the only thing we can do is turn the United States into Norway. Sandy says, I think women are going to come out in huge numbers to vote. That appears to be the indications. The registrations for women went sky high over the preceding months. What we're seeing in some of the ballot initiative elections is women really coming out. In the early voting, we're seeing women really coming out. In Georgia, also, there was a record turnout of blacks so far in the early voting, as well as women, independent women. Both of those things are very good for Democrats. Kay says, in the old days, wives worked low-income jobs, absolutely. And so now their retirement is lower because they worked the low-income jobs in the old days. Ghostot says, Julian Assange is my litmus test, but free Assange. As important as a free press is, the first order of business is to get the Congress going to the voters to get their votes rather than going to the donors to get their votes. Have to prioritize things, okay, in a different way. We'll get protection of the press when we get the donors out of the political system, the big donors. Sandy says, you're never too old to live in Norway. Maybe not, but you're too old to be accepted as residents, okay, of Norway. Steve Wolfbrand says, smash the like button. Thank you, Steve. And the share and subscribe button as well. Thank you very much, folks. Please go to my Patreon account occasionally and buy me a coffee, okay, occasionally. It does take some money to keep going with this now. I'm working very hard now. Lots and lots of streams. I had 3 streams again today. I had only 1 stream yesterday because we had to do something. Okay, and then it was too late to do any daytime streams. So I ended up with a rather lengthy stream about the Fetterman-Oz debate. So thank you all for liking this. I'm getting impressions that you do like it. I'll be back tomorrow with 3 more streams. So thank you very much. Please keep in mind the litmus test. Please keep in mind the importance of defeating the fascists, okay, this time around. But Kay says, thank you, Joe. I love you, buddy. I love all of you followers too. And Dolores says, thank you and good night. Please keep in mind these 2 things, defeating the fascists and the money litmus test. For 2024, we're really going to have to defeat those who take the big money. It's going to be really critical then And defeating the fascists is critical now because we have to stop the trends towards giving the state legislatures control, okay, of our elections. We're looking at our whole democracy being destroyed. We got to stop that. So thank you all, and we love you too, Kay. And we love you too, Lana. We love you too, Sandy. We love you too, Dolores. So, a good night, all. I'll be back again tomorrow with some very good stuff.